So, hello and welcome back yet again as we journey on towards the center of the earth with Professor Lindenbrock, Axel, and Hans, who we left in quite a dire predicament as they have maybe a half a day's worth of water, and that would be on extremely short rations, and a several days walk back just to get to where they started where there's no water. So, I mean, we're only like halfway through this book, so obviously they're going to make it. I'm very curious to see how. I mean, maybe there will be a sudden rainstorm that sluices water down the chimney or something cuz I mean, it seems like quite dire straits for our intrepid explorers. I'm definitely interested in seeing how this all pans out. It looks like these might be two slightly shorter chapters, so a little bit shorter tonight, but that's okay. When we pick this back up on Saturday night, it looks like chapter 23 is quite hefty, at least for this book. So I hope that you guys are enjoying this story as much as I am. And with all of that being said, let's jump back into Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, beginning with chapter 21. The next day, we started very early. We had to hurry. We were a 5-day walk away from our crossroads. I will not insist on the suffering we endured during our return. My uncle bore them with the rage of a man who does not feel his strongest. Hans, with the resignation of his passive nature. I, I confess I bore it with complaints and expressions of despair. I had no spirit with which to oppose this misfortune. As I had foreseen, we ran completely out of water by the end of the first day's march. Our liquid food was now nothing but gin, but this infernal liquid burned my throat, and I could not even endure the sight of it. I found the temperature stifling. Exhaustion paralyzed me, and more than once I almost fell and lay motionless. Then we stopped, and my uncle and Hans comforted me as best as they could, but I saw already that the former was struggling painfully against excessive fatigue and the torture of thirst. At last, on Tuesday, July 7th, we arrived half dead at the junction of the two tunnels by dragging ourselves on our knees, on our hands, and then I dropped down like an inert mass, stretched out on the lava soil. It was 10 in the morning. Hans and my uncle, clinging to the wall, tried to nibble a few bits of biscuit, but long moans escaped from my swollen lips. After a while, my uncle approached me and raised me up in his arms. "Poor boy," he said, in a genuine tone of compassion. I was touched by these words, not being used to tenderness out of the fierce professor. I seized his trembling hands with mine. He let me hold them, and he looked at me. His eyes were moist. Then I saw him take the flask hanging at his side, and to my amazement, he placed it to my lips. "Drink," he said. Had I heard him right? Was my uncle beside himself? I stared at him stupidly, as though I could not understand him. "Drink," he said again. And raising his flask, he emptied every drop between my lips. Infinite pleasure. A sip of water came to moisten my burning mouth. Just one, but it was enough to call back my ebbing life. I thanked my uncle with clasped hands. Yes, he told me. A drink of water. The last one, do you hear me? The last one. I had carefully kept it at the bottom of my flask. 20 times. 100 times. I have had to resist a frightening desire to drink, but no, Axel. I kept it for you. Uncle, I murmured, while tears came to my eyes. Yes, poor child. I knew that as soon as you arrived at this crossroads, you would drop half dead, and I kept my last drop of water to reanimate you. Thank you. Thank you, I cried. Although my thirst was only partly quenched, I had nonetheless regained a bit of strength. My throat muscles, until then contracted, all relaxed again, and the inflammation of my lips abated a little. I was able to speak. Let's see, I said. Now we have only one choice. We're out of water. We have to go back. As I said this, my uncle avoided looking at me. He lowered his head, and his eyes avoided mine. We must return and go back on the way to Snoffells. May God just give us the strength to climb the crater again. Return, said my uncle, as if he were speaking to himself rather than me. Yes, return. We can't lose a minute. A long silence followed. So then, Axel, said the professor in a strange voice, these few drops of water have given you no courage or energy. Courage? I see you just as discouraged as you were before, and still expressing nothing but despair. What kind of a man was I dealing with, and what plans was his darting mind hatching? What? I said. You don't want to give up on our expedition just when all the signs are that it can succeed? Never. Then we have to resign ourselves to death? No, Axel, no. Go back. I don't want your death. Let Hans accompany you. Leave me alone. Leave you here? Leave me, I tell you. I've started this journey, and I will continue it to the end, or I won't return. Now go, Axel, go. My uncle was speaking in extreme overexcitement. His voice, tender for a moment, had once again become hard and threatening. He struggled against the impossible with a sinister energy. I did not want to leave at the bottom of this cavern, but on the other hand, my instinct of self-preservation was telling me to flee. Hans was watching this scene with his normal indifference, yet he understood what was going on between his two companions. The gestures themselves were enough to indicate the different paths on which each of us was trying to lead the other. But Hans seemed to take little interest in the question on which his life depended. He was ready to start if the signal for departure was given, or stay according to my uncle's least wish. How I wished at that moment that I could make him understand me. My words, my moans, my tone would have overcome that cold nature of his. These dangers, which our guide did not seem to anticipate, I would have made Hans understand and confront them. Together, we might perhaps have convinced the obstinate professor. If necessary, we would have forced him to climb back up to the heights of the Snoffells. I approached Hans. I put my hand on his, and he did not move. I showed him the route to the crater. He was still immobile. My panting face revealed my suffering, but the Icelander gently shook his head and, calmly pointing to my uncle, said, "Master." "Master!" I yelled. "You madman! No, he isn't the master of your life. We must flee and take him with us. Do you hear me? Do you understand?" I had taken Hans by the arm. I wanted to force him to get up. I struggled with him, and then my uncle intervened. "Calm down, Axel," he said. "You'll achieve nothing with Hans. So, listen to what I want to propose to you." I crossed my arms, and I looked my uncle straight in the face. "The lack of water," he told me, "is the only obstacle for the realization of my plans. In this eastern tunnel, made up of lava, schist, and coal, we have not found a single particle of moisture. It's possible that we'll be more fortunate if we go in the western tunnel." I shook my head with an air of profound skepticism. "Hear me out," said the professor with a firm voice. "While you were lying here motionlessly, I went to explore the structure of that tunnel. It goes directly into the bowels of the globe, and in a few hours it'll take us to the granite formations. There, we should find plenty of springs. The nature of the rock implies this, and instinct agrees with logic to support my conviction. Now, this is what I propose to you. When Columbus asked his ship's crew for 3 more days to discover new land, his crew, frightened and sick as they were, recognized the legitimacy of his claim, and he discovered the New World. I am the Columbus of this netherworld, and I only ask for 1 more day. If after that day I haven't found the water that we're missing, I swear to you, we'll return to the surface." In spite of my irritation, I was moved by these words and the violence my uncle was doing to himself by speaking in this manner. "Well, then," I said, "let's do what you wish, and may God reward your superhuman energy. You now have only a few hours left to tempt fortune. Let's go." And that is the end of chapter 21. Poor Axel. I don't blame him. I'd be like, you know what? I'm really dehydrated and very miserable, but I bet I can find the energy to climb up that lava tube. I don't do well when I'm dehydrated, and I don't think very many people do. Speaking of that, I'm going to go get a drink, and we will do the next chapter. All right, thirst quenched, unlike Axel, I'm ready to delve back down and see what is going to happen in chapter 22 of Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. The descent started over again, this time by way of the other tunnel. Hans went first, as was his custom. We had not walked 100 paces when the professor, moving his lantern along the walls, exclaimed, "Here are primitive rocks. Now we're on the right way. Let's go, let's go." When the Earth was slowly cooling in its early stages, its contraction produced displacements, ruptures, retrenchments, and cracks in the crust. Our current tunnel was one such fissure through which eruptive granite flowed at one time. Its 1,000 turns formed an inexorable labyrinth in the primeval soil. As we descended, the succession of layers that made up the primitive foundation manifested itself more distinctly. Geological science considers this primitive matter the base of the mineral crust and has discovered that it is made up of 3 different strata: schists, gnests, and mica schists, resting on that unshakable rock called granite. Never, never had mineralogists found themselves in such wonderful circumstances to study nature in stew. What the drill? An unintelligent, brutal machine could not relay to the surface about the inner texture of the globe we were able to examine with our own eyes and touch with our own hands. Through the beds of schists, colored in beautiful shades of green, meandered metallic threads of copper and manganese with traces of platinum and gold. I thought about these riches buried in the bowels of the globe that greedy humanity will never get to enjoy. These treasures have been buried at such depths by the upheavals of primeval days that neither ice pick nor pickaxe will ever tear them from their graves. The schists were succeeded by stratified gneisses, remarkable for the parallelism and the regularity of its laminate, and then mica schists arranged in large sheets that were outlined to the eye by the sparkling white mica. The light from our devices, reflected from the small facets in the masses of rock, shot sparkling rays off at every angle, and I imagined that I was traveling through a hollowed-out diamond on whose inside the light beams shattered in 1,000 coruscations. At about 6 o'clock, this feast of light diminished appreciably and then almost ceased. The walls took on a crystalline but dark appearance. Mica mingled more intimately with feldspar and quartz to form the essential rock, the hardest stone of all, the one that supports the 4 layered terrains of the globe. We were now immured in an immense prison of granite. It was 8 in the evening. There was still no water. I was suffering horribly. My uncle walked at the front. He refused to stop. He was listening anxiously for the murmur of some spring, but nothing. But my legs refused to carry me one step further. I resisted my torture so as not to force my uncle to stop. It would have been a stroke of desperate misfortune for him, because the day was coming to an end, the last day that belonged to him. Finally, my strength left me, and I uttered a cry and fell. "Come to me! I'm dying!" My uncle retraced his steps. He looked at me with his arms crossed, and then these words passed his lips. "It's all over." The last thing I saw was a frightening gesture of rage, and I closed my eyes. When I reopened them, I saw my 2 companions motionless, rolled up in their blankets. Were they asleep? As for me, I couldn't get one moment of sleep. I was suffering too much, especially from the thought that there was no remedy. My uncle's last words echoed in my ear. "It's all over." For in such a state of weakness, it was impossible to think of going back to the surface. We had 1.5 leagues of terrestrial crust on top of us. It seemed to me that the weight of this mass was bearing down on my shoulders with all its might. I felt crushed and exhausted myself with violent exertions just to turn over on my granite couch. A few hours passed. Deep silence reigned all around us, the silence of the grave. Nothing reached us through these walls, the thinnest of which was probably 5 miles thick. Yet, in the midst of my slumber, I believed I heard a sound. It was dark in the tunnel. I looked more carefully, and I seemed to see Hans vanishing with the lamp in his hand. Why this departure? Was Hans going to abandon us? My uncle was fast asleep, and I wanted to shout. My voice could not find a passage through my parched lips. The darkness became deeper, and the sounds died away. I managed to yell, "Hans is abandoning us! Hans! Hans!" But these words were only uttered within me. They didn't go any farther. Yet after the first moment of terror, I felt ashamed of my suspicions against a man whose conduct had been nothing suspect at all so far. His departure could not be an escape. Instead of ascending the tunnel, he seemed to be descending. Evil intentions would have taken him up, not down. This thought calmed me a little, and I returned to another set of thoughts. Only a serious motive could have torn such a peaceful man from his sleep. Was he going on discovery? Had he heard something in the silent night that had not reached all the way to me? And that cliffhanger leaves us as we finish chapter 22. That is one heck of a cliffhanger to leave us on, but it should be pretty good. I think Hans must be going to get water. Otherwise, this book is going to end really, really quickly. And then we'll have like 20 more chapters of, I don't know, life as a ghost. I don't think Jules Verne did ghost stories. I think he was more sci-fi. So I doubt that Hans is going anywhere except to find water. Anyway, that is going to be it for tonight. Now, don't forget, there will not be a chapter tomorrow night, but if you would like to come to my live stream and watch me pull my hair out playing The Sims, that is what I do on Friday nights at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Eastern U.S. time? Yeah, Eastern U.S. time. Whatever that translates to in your time zone, that is what I do on Fridays. So thank you so much for listening. Please do leave me a thumbs up. It does always make me smile. And I will see you Saturday night.